But there is a bit of, let me put this to you. Is there a difference between tax cuts and new spending in the sense that does, does a tax cut help with productivity, whereas new spending is just inherently inflationary in one direction? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you're not going to cut spending, because remember, the real level of taxation in an economy is what the government spends. That's the tax. So if the government is spending $7 trillion, we have a $7 trillion cost to cover one way or the other. And so if they don't collect it in an income tax or a tariff or something like that, then they're going to borrow the money and we're going to have higher interest rates and more inflation. So we're going to pay for government by paying higher prices. Now, if you cut taxes in a way that stimulates investment, so I lower taxes and the money that would have been spent by the government is now invested in the private sector and growing the economy. I don't mean spent, but plant and equipment, things like that, that will make us more productive. But the offset is if the government just runs a bigger deficit, now the government has to tap into the capital markets to borrow that money. So it crowds it out. You don't really get the full effect. But the type of tax cuts that Trump is talking about, the biggest ones, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, no tax on tips. People earning tips are not going to be funding economic growth by making investments. They're going to go out and spend the money, right? They're broke, their credit card is run up. So it's just pure spending. So it's inflationary because the government's not going to stop spending, but now people are going to spend more. The government's going to spend the same and borrow the difference. So those type of tax cuts that just fuel increased consumption in the private sector don't grow the economy. They just grow the debt. They just grow inflation. So that's really what we're likely to see as a result of the overall Trump tax cuts is just more inflation. And it may make the GDP look bigger, but that's only because we're measuring it with depreciated dollars. And the CPI never keeps pace with the actual rate of inflation. And the same thing happens with a GDP deflator. That's why, the voters know that they're so much worse off than they were when Biden took office, even though supposedly the economy has grown a lot and we've created all these jobs. The problem is the jobs we created were second and third jobs that people now are forced to take because they can't get by on one. And the reason it looks like the economy is bigger is because we're not deflating it enough with the deflator. I actually think that the economy is smaller now than it was when Biden took office, if you measure it in real money. I mean, if you measure it in the price of gold, clearly we're in a massive recession. If you try to look at what GDP is in gold terms versus what it was when Biden took office.
To ask you about a particular situation that could have unfolded that didn't. So we were hearing a lot from the Harris camp about taxation of unrealized capital gains. And that spooked a lot of people. Let's just say maybe Warren Buffett was selling a lot of his position because he wanted to realize the capital gains before that policy possibly came into effect. However, he's holding it in cash. He didn't decide to go into gold. Are there others, do you believe, that were piling into gold because of this risk?
Yeah, I think Buffett has made a mistake by stockpiling cash instead of gold. But Buffett, he may know in his bones that he should be buying gold, but he doesn't want to send that message. I think he's a little bit cognizant of what would happen if Berkshire Hathaway was loading up on gold. So I just don't think he wants to send that message to the world that, hey, I'm so scared of the dollar that I'm passing up this 5% interest and I'm buying the yellow metal. But I have a feeling that he knows that he'd probably be better off in gold, but he's just not willing to make that statement. And so he's trying to stay in the dollar. But I think your point is an accurate one about the relief rally in that we dodged that bullet. I don't know how real the threat of a tax on unrealized capital gain was, right. A wealth tax in disguise. It's certainly unconstitutional, although, the Constitution hasn't necessarily been a great barrier recently because a lot of things that the government does are unconstitutional, but they get away with it. And so whether or not they would have been able to get away with a wealth tax, with an unapportioned wealth tax, is hard to say. But it certainly was a very scary tax for the market because you just think about all these, significant investors who, started companies, like an Elon Musk. You start a company and you get in early, and now you've got billions and billions of unrealized gains.
Yeah.
I mean, Elon Musk is rich, but he's not that liquid. He may have a few hundred million in assets, but he doesn't have, a few hundred billion in assets, but he doesn't have 50 billion sitting in a checking account to pay a tax on those unrealized gains. So guys like that, how would they raise the money to pay their tax? Well, they got to sell their stock. They got to sell a lot of stock, and it wouldn't just be Elon Musk selling stock. Zuckerberg, or Mark Zuckerberg is selling stock, and Jeff Bezos is selling stock, and all these guys are selling stock. What's going to happen to the stock market? But of course, now what's going to happen to private businesses? Guys own a private company. They have no liquidity. How are they going to do that? I mean, are you going to have a fire sale on a bunch of, private businesses? I mean, so it would have been a disaster, an accounting disaster. I mean, there's a reason that the founding fathers made a tax like that unconstitutional, right? They don't want Americans to have to suffer. I mean, if the Constitution hadn't been amended, we wouldn't have an income tax either. We'd be much better off without an income tax. The framers didn't want the U.S. government with an income tax. In fact, we got the income tax in 1913 as a trade-off for the tariffs. They said, "Hey, we'll take away the tariffs on the working people, and we'll put these taxes on the rich, this little income tax." And that was a trade-off, and it was a rotten deal because the income taxes are so much higher than what they said, and they apply to just about everybody. In fact, in many cases, the middle class are paying higher marginal tax rates than a lot of people who are super wealthy. So it was another sense where it backfired on the public. But ever since we've got the income tax, the government is like 20 times larger than it was without the income tax. And I don't think there's any way the government could have grown this enormous, without that tax. And so if we opened up, another opportunity for the government to seize our wealth through a wealth tax, it would have funded an even bigger expansion of government. And so, yeah, for the moment, that threat is gone. And I don't see it arising at all during the Trump term. The question is, 4 years from now, when the economy is worse than it was when Trump took office, and they vote for change again, and now elect a Democrat who's probably even more radically left than Kamala Harris was, maybe under that administration, they might talk about it again.
All right, I got to ask you, obviously you brought up Elon Musk, so I got to put Doge to the Department of Government Efficiency. So him and Vivek Ramaswamy have been tasked with finding waste and bad spending in government. Let's add to that well, we'll see obviously what they're able to do after the mandate's up in about 2 years and a half. But with the tariffs, Peter, and combined with reining in spending, can that be offset by, or can that offset the tax cut that Trump plans to put ahead?
Well, first of all, the Department of Government Efficiency, which would be an oxymoron if we really had such a department, but it's all marketing. I mean, Donald Trump is a showman. I mean, that's how he made his living, right? He's, a lot of entertainment. There is no Department of Government Efficiency. It's not a government department. Elon Musk is not in the president's cabinet. He's not, he's not the secretary of that department. It's a think tank. It exists completely outside of government. All it does is make recommendations of ways to cut government spending. We already have dozens of private organizations that are doing this. In fact, one of the things that Donald Trump ran away from on the campaign trail was this 2025 plan that was put out. What was it, Cato or Heritage? And it was a long blueprint of all the things that you can cut in government. And Donald Trump was like, no, I want nothing to do with that. No, I've never even seen that, right? Because he was afraid to embrace that because they wanted to attack him for all the programs he wanted to cut, right? So he's like, no, I got nothing to do with that plan. I mean, so what Elon Musk is going to propose is no different than what's already been proposed, right? I mean, you can find all kinds of ways to say, hey, we don't need this, we don't need this. But at the end of the day, none of it happens because nothing can be cut unless Congress votes to cut it, and they're not going to do it. First of all, almost half the Congress, even though the Republicans have the Senate, almost half the Congress are Democrats. To a man and woman, they will vote against any of that. So now you're going to need almost unanimous support from the Republicans, 98%. There's no way. Half the Republicans are rhinos, so you're never going to get it. You're not going to get 60 votes in the Senate. So nothing really is going to get cut. As far as firing government workers, good luck. I mean, the civil servant union is like the strongest union. You get a job in government, you're there for life. Yep. It's almost impossible to fire these guys, even for cause. And so, no, the only way you can get rid of them is you have to buy them out. You have to offer them, 2 or 3 years severance and hope they take the money, right? But that's a big cost in the short run. It will take years for that investment to pay off. You can just not hire anybody and kind of let the workforce shrink a bit by attrition. But that cost savings is so small compared to the revenue that's going to be lost through the tax cuts, not just the new tax cuts, but the extension of the old Trump tax cuts and the expansion of those cuts, because now he wants to bring the full SALT deduction back and he wants to lower the corporate rate even further. So we're going to have bigger deficits in Trump's second term. Biden, I just mentioned earlier today, the national debt just took out $36 trillion for the first time today. So Biden has now added, I think, $8.2 trillion to the debt in less than 4 years. So that broke Trump's record, which was $7.8 trillion. He had the record until Biden. But government spending and deficits went up a lot under Trump, even before COVID. So the combination of these tax cuts, mostly that are Keynesian stimulus type tax cuts, right? Where you don't tax Social Security benefits, they spend more money, right? Most people who are living on Social Security, they're not saving for their old age anymore. I mean, they're in their old age. They're spending that money, right, on products they didn't help produce and mostly are going to be imported. So our trade deficits, which are already at record highs, are going to set even more records. And yes, we're going to slap tariffs on Americans who buy imports, and they're going to pay those tariffs, and they're going to use their tax cuts to pay tariffs. But the net effect of all the tax hikes and tax cuts, I think, is a bigger deficit and higher inflation.
All right, let's talk about those tariffs, because I think they're important. Now, you've been out of the American market. You felt that, the American stock market was overpriced. You've been focusing really on the international markets. Does tariffs, or the imposition of tariffs, does that hurt American companies? Is it now time to look abroad?
Well, ever since Trump won, the U.S. stocks have gone way up and the foreign markets have gone down, especially if you price them in U.S. dollars, because we've had, a strong dollar. But if you understand tariffs, and obviously Trump doesn't understand tariffs, right? And he must be being advised by people who don't understand tariffs or who are just don't want to level with him. But tariffs always hurt the most the nation that imposes them, right? Because what you're doing is you're driving up prices on, imported goods. And so Americans now have to pay higher prices to consume those goods, or they don't consume them at all because they can't afford them. With less competition coming in from abroad, U.S. companies can raise their prices higher than they otherwise would have been. And so the Americans suffer because before the tariffs, they were benefiting from trade. They were benefiting from comparative advantage. I mean, if I could buy something cheaper from China, well, I'm going to buy it. And if the government says, no, you can't, well, now I have to pay more money for it from somebody else, or I can't buy it at all because I can't afford it anymore. We don't even make it here. So, yes, there are going to be some foreign companies that are hurt, companies that are going to sell fewer products to the U.S., they'll be hurt. Now, what are they going to do with those products? They're going to sell them to other customers in other countries for maybe a little bit less money than they were going to get selling them to Americans. But that's a huge benefit for those consumers in those other countries who now get a good deal. They don't have to compete with Americans anymore because we're out of the market. So you're going to have winners from our tariffs, but they're outside the United States. They're not inside the United States. We lose. It's like you're shooting yourself in the foot with the tariffs. Trump put tariffs on, heavy tariffs, during his first term. And our trade deficit was much higher when he left office than it was when he came into office. So the tariffs didn't work from that perspective. He promised to lower the deficit, trade deficits, and they went in the other direction. And the other problem with tariffs is they can make American exporters less competitive if their key imported components are a lot more expensive, and they eat the tariffs. It may be that Trump will give exporters a credit for the tariffs they paid on the way in, or something like that, to maintain some competitiveness. But it's not going to work. It's not going to raise enough revenue to offset the tax cuts. It's not going to restore our global competitiveness. Their deregulations will help. I mean, that's more important than tariffs. But we actually need a lot less government spending. We need to free up a lot of resources that would go from consumption to production, and that's not going to happen. So I think the markets have this wrong. And the other impact that tariffs could have on the dollar, because people think tariffs are good for the dollar, they're actually not. Because if America starts importing less because the prices are so much higher, we can't afford it, foreigners might feel that, okay, well, there's less incentive for us now to try to prop up the dollar because we're not earning as many as we were. We're trading more with other countries, and so the dollar, isn't used as much if they're not dealing with it in the U.S. And so the dollar could go down because it's now less important in global trade, and China might start focusing on other countries where it is selling its goods and the currencies it's earning over there. So there already was a move out of the dollar, and I would think tariffs would just accelerate that to the extent that, hey, we can't even trade with these guys anymore. Because of the tariffs. Why are we beating our brains out to prop the currency up that we're not even earning?
Yeah, which is really interesting because Donald Trump has made it very clear that he wants the dollar a little bit lower for exactly that reason, to increase.
Well, he wants the dollar lower, but he also wants everybody holding it as the reserve currency.
Right.
He doesn't want people getting out of the dollar. He says, if I see you getting out of the dollar, I'm going to slap you with 200% tariffs. Right? He wants to, but then he says, I want everybody to hold the dollar, but I want the dollar to go down. So in other words, he wants everybody to hold our dollar and then lose. It's like, well, if you're telling me you want a lower dollar, then why should I hold on to it? You're telling me get rid of it because if I hold it, it's going to go down. So the two positions